Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's subject is the suggestion of patron Joe Cool, who wanted me to look at the well-known manga series Berserk. Now Berserk has been around for decades and is still going today, so I've decided to limit the scope of my review to the first 5 volumes. That covers the opening arc and the first few chapters of the Golden Age arc. About the author. Kentaro Miura was born in 1966 in a place called Chiba, which is part of the Tokyo metropolitan area. Miura was apparently interested in manga writing even as a child, and he published several unofficial and amateur works as he went through school and through art college. In 1988, he created Oro, which was essentially a rough draft for Berserk. Berserk itself would get its first release in the October 1989 edition of a magazine called Monthly Animal House. It would later on get moved to a companion magazine called Young Animal. Miura would work on a few other projects during the early 90s, but when the Golden Age arc got going in 1992, Berserk got a lot of attention and has been his primary focus ever since. What's especially interesting about the series is that Miura does all the work himself. A lot of mangas are created by a team that includes a lead artist, a lead writer, and several assistants, but Miura draws every line and writes every word of Berserk on his own. That's a big reason why the series is still ongoing today and has only reached 41 volumes. Another Young Animal series called Detroit Metal City took around 5 years to produce 10 volumes, and if Berserk was made at that rate, it would be up to volume 54. Of course, part of the problem is that Miura keeps getting distracted by working on the many adaptations of his work. The first anime adaptation came out in 1997, and it covered up to the end of the Golden Age arc. Then there was a series of movies covering the Golden Age in 2012 and 2013, but it uses a bunch of rather poorly produced CGI. Then there was a second TV series in 2016 and 2017 that actually advanced the story. And there have been a couple of video games with independent stories that were at least outlined by Miura himself. And while it's not a direct adaptation, it's also fairly clear that Berserk was at least one of the main inspirations for other Japanese dark fantasy games like Demon's Souls and Dark Souls. Anyway, I'm straying off topic. It's time I look at the manga itself. The review. The story begins in medias res, which I expect is a way for Miura to show people where the story will end up after an extended flashback. And when I say extended, I mean that Miura spent the next 6 years catching up to the present. Anyway, the opening arc presents us with Guts, a wandering mercenary with a mechanical left arm, a repeating crossbow, and a 200-pound sharpened slab of metal that you could technically call a sword. Guts goes around hunting apostles, humans who have sold their souls to become immortal demons. The ones providing these deals are called the God Hand, and Guts was personally marked for sacrifice by a demon in the God Hand called Femto by his fellows, and Griffith by Guts. After establishing all of that, we flash back to Guts' birth. He fell out of his hanged mother's womb and got adopted by a band of mercenaries. He was regularly abused by his father figure and forced to learn how to fight at the age of 6. He killed said father figure at the age of 10 when the man got drunk and tried to murder Guts, and after that he bounced around a few other mercenary companies until he got discovered by Griffith, the leader of the Band of the Hawk. Griffith challenges Guts to single combat and wins, and as the victor, he makes Guts join the band. 3 years later, the Band of the Hawk becomes so successful that the King of Midland grants Griffith the rank of Viscount. However, things start to get a little weird after that, when a guy called a Nosferatu Zod turns into an unkillable minotaur and yet retreats when he sees the crimson behelit that Griffith wears. In terms of the artwork, Berserk is gorgeous. Not every panel has backgrounds, which is standard enough for a manga, but those that do have intricately drawn architecture, massive crowds, and a lot of faithfully drawn medieval swords and armor. You can tell when the Band of Hawks' fortunes rise because the armor they wear becomes more intricate and expensive while still being very practical. You also get a lot of varied camera angles that clearly give Miura a challenge when it comes to perspective. Something else he does is give every character a very distinct appearance. It's not just different outfits and hairstyles. On the other hand, the content of the story is much more disgusting, and that is entirely by design. Berserk is not a series that's easy to read, and aside from the blood and gore you might expect, the first 5 volumes also include depictions of child abuse, child rape, child murder, cannibalism, demonic orgies, torture, mutilation, and a whole lot of terrible people doing terrible things. Or, to put it more succinctly, you could very reasonably put the label trigger warning all on the spines of the Berserk manga. But I want to be clear that I'm not saying this as a criticism. None of these activities are portrayed in a positive light, and in fact, the most depraved individuals who enjoy such things literally cast aside their humanity and become demons. Guts himself is a victim of abuse and trauma, and is exactly as messed up as you would expect from someone who has lived through as horrible a life as he has. Now, there's always an argument to make that it's hard to depict warfare and combat in a way that doesn't glorify it to some extent, but Berserk certainly tries its best. Battles are consistently depicted as disgusting and brutal, and the more a character enjoys combat, the worse of a person they are. That includes Guts, by the way, and while Griffith appears to be the exception at first, he's actually the worst sort of person out of all of them. To sum it all up, or at least to sum up the first 5 volumes, Berserk is a good story with great artwork that I strongly recommend to anyone who can stomach its contents. It won't be easy to read, but it'll be worth it. The analysis. Berserk is a story about survival. Not just ordinary survival, but survival in the face of abuse and trauma. It's a story about how to let go of a traumatic past and start living for the sake of a better future. And it's about what can happen to people who can't get past their trauma and instead perpetuate the cycle of violence and cruelty. The Behelit is an artifact that only activates when a person is at their lowest point. And when the God Hand arrive, they promise to remove all feelings of pain, guilt, and suffering in exchange for the lives of everyone they care about. In other words, if they lose their link to the rest of humanity, if they give up on being a good person and caring about other people, then they will live forever as monsters. Monsters who cause other people to suffer, who torture and rape and murder simply because those are the only sources of happiness and joy they have left. When we first meet Guts, he's almost at his lowest point. He hunts apostles so he can get revenge on Griffith, not to help any of the people they torment. But he still has a glimmer of humanity deep inside, a part of himself that still cares about the suffering of others and wants to help them out. It's just that he feels powerless to do so. I think all of that is why the first secondary character we meet is Puck, a tiny elf who really does not look like he belongs in the Berserk setting. He constantly breaks model, he doesn't have any shading or details, and he has a much more consistently positive attitude than any other character we meet. And yet he exists, and he hangs out with Guts despite the man's hostility because Puck knows that deep down, Guts is suffering and needs someone to pull him out of the pit of despair he's in. And sometimes Puck makes his role even more obvious by shouting out the theme of the current story. So while the villains give in to despair and give up their humanity, Guts is a protagonist who almost does the same thing, but gets pulled back from the precipice by his stubborn refusal to give up, and by a positive influence in his life. It's certainly possible that the themes change or evolve as the story goes on, but as far as the beginning goes, I'd say that Berserk is not a story about killing, so much as it is a story about living. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.